Susie Alegre is a lawyer who has become extremely interested. She is British, although she's not only is she British, she is the what is the Isle of Man Information Commissioner? Is that exactly the term? What is it again?
No, I'm the Interception of Communications Commissioner, so I do oversight of phone tapping in the Isle of Man as
So
one of
in
my
the Isle of Man, where she's from, which is actually more or less part of the UK, she oversees whether or not you can wiretap somebody or check out their email, etc. And anyway, I guess I want to just let you describe what you do in the course of the interview, Susie, but you are a practiced lawyer, worked for Amnesty International and other things in the past. But you've had epiphanies in recent times about human rights and how they haven't been factored um, in online governance and even the discussion about the online sphere. So how did that happen that you had those epiphanies, and what are you beginning to conclude?
Well, I think, as you said, my background has been very much working in international law and human rights law in particular, in a really broad range of spheres, particularly human rights and security, human rights and counterterrorism for international organizations, and combating corruption. And sort of within that, and looking particularly at the security sphere, and when you start looking at things like border management, I had done a lot of work around data protection and privacy in that kind of area, and looking at the technological implications for privacy. But while I sort of knew all about the GDPR, while I spent a lot of time looking at privacy and data protection, it never quite got me that this was the biggest problem of our time. And when it really struck me, as you say, a kind of epiphany about what I feel is one of the key human rights issues of our time, was precisely, and I just heard you talking about it there, was following the Brexit vote, following the Trump vote. The first time I read about Cambridge Analytica, sort of ironically through Facebook on my phone sometime in the middle of the night in January 2017, this idea of behavioral microtargeting and political behavioral microtargeting literally made my blood run cold, because I felt like this isn't about privacy, or it's marginally about privacy. Privacy is part of the jigsaw. But what it's really about is people's right to freedom of thought, and our right to have a sort of mental integrity, if you like, and autonomy. Because when I was thinking about what they were trying to do, this fundamental idea that by looking at our data on Facebook, they could understand how we think, how we feel, what buttons ideally to press, and use that information to then turn it around and target and manipulate us. Not to change somebody from voting for Brexit to not voting for Brexit, but perhaps to identify somebody, who is a Remainer, say, and maybe make them feel a little more tired about going to the poll, maybe make them think they don't need to because it's all fine. And this kind of idea that our data could give these insights and sort of open up windows almost into our souls to affect the way we operate, that to me seemed to be something so fundamental, and so fundamental to this idea of the right to freedom of thought inside our own heads, that was my really great epiphany as to where we need to focus when we're looking at the future and our future for human rights and technology.
So this idea of freedom of thought being a key undiscussed concept. Elaborate on that a little further, if you would.
Well, the idea of the right to freedom of thought, if you like, is not necessarily something that our ancestors would have recognized. Sort of famously, organized religion is not a huge fan of everybody going off and thinking for themselves. But you kind of see in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in Europe, people like Spinoza, and then in the 19th century, we have J.S. Mill in the UK, started to explore this idea that we all have a right to freedom of thought, and that this is a natural right, that we all must be able to think for ourselves and have this kind of human autonomy. And then when you see the Universal Declaration on Human Rights being drawn up after the atrocities of the Second World War, and obviously in the wake of the huge damage caused by Nazi propaganda, and the understanding and impact that propaganda has on populations and on our rights. This right to freedom of thought and a related right to freedom of opinion were incorporated into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and then later into the International Bill of Rights that you see at UN level and at regional levels. And what this right involves, when you look at freedom of thought, and freedom of opinion works in a similar way, you have an internal right and an external right. So I have the right to think what I like inside my head. The minute I start telling you what I think or manifesting what I believe, then there can be limitations put on that. So freedom of expression, as soon as I start talking, you can say, I need to be quiet for whatever reason, whether it's to protect the rights of others, for security reasons, whatever. There are reasons why you can limit expression. But that right to think whatever I want inside my head is absolute. And that means that it can never be interfered with. And one of the things that I found really interesting when I started looking at it was that this idea of an absolute right, which is an incredibly strong protection, almost led to the right being forgotten, because most of the commentators just said, we all have a right to freedom of thought inside our heads. But of course, no government can get inside our heads, so it doesn't matter. We don't need to deal with it. And it's almost that because of this idea that, of course, we have autonomy inside our heads, that this right has sort of been languishing and hasn't got the attention that I feel it's deserved, even earlier. When you look at things like advertising, subliminal advertising, the whole idea of advertising is to be able to affect the way people think. So the kind of notion that nobody can get inside our heads slightly undermines that. And I think that is, again, is the big question when you look at micro-targeting is, either it doesn't work, or it's an invasion of our right to freedom of thought. But even if it doesn't work, the idea that somebody could do that is in itself a threat to our right to freedom of thought.
But even in a world, I love that. In a world of algorithmically driven feeds that we are essentially fed, that in itself becomes, I would say, problematic by the definition of your concern. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think what's really problematic, when you start looking at it as well, this right to freedom of thought has three planks within this internal right. The first one is the right to keep your thoughts private, so you don't have to reveal to anyone what you're thinking. And if you think about this idea of big data and inferences being made and profiling happening on a sort of constant basis as we're just going about our daily business online, well, that is in a sense an attempt to get inside our minds, to get beyond our natural filters and our decisions as to what we're going to express. And that, as you say, is sort of algorithmically driven inferences about what we're thinking. Whether or not they're accurate is a different matter. But the drafters of human rights law recognize that even the fact that people are making inferences about what you think is problematic. And then the second plank is this freedom from manipulation. And so once you've got that profiling based on your data, what it's being used is to tailor information coming in to your mind, tailor the way you're receiving that information. So it's not just the information, but also the way and the order you get it. And, Facebook did an experiment about 7 years ago, I think it was now, about mass emotional contagion, where they showed that just by changing the order of people's news feeds, they could alter people's moods. And if you think about that, on a huge scale, that's astonishing that just by tweaking your news feed, they can change the way you feel. And that's going to obviously have a huge impact on the way you feel, how the way you interact with other people, the way you go about your business. And then the third part of it is the right not to be penalized for your thoughts. And that's where you go back to the inferences. And you can see that even in that there are obviously, horrendous examples of people being imprisoned because of their ideas or their beliefs or inferences about them. But even on a kind of day-to-day basis, the idea that somebody, for example, may not get an advert for a good university course that might completely transform their life because inferences have been made about them and profiling has been carried out that's decided that they're not the kind of person that should benefit from these kind of opportunities. And if you like, all our futures are dependent on the opportunities that we are presented with and the things that we see around us. And as you say, in the tech space and in the digital space, these are being curated by algorithms.
Right. And in fact, that experiment that you described of Facebook's just happened to have become known because they published it in an academic paper. In reality, I think it's quite certain that they do such experiments every single day. Whether with the intent of changing the way people feel or not is essentially immaterial, because in effect, that is what they are doing without taking any responsibility for it. You make a really interesting point about why companies don't talk about human rights and talk about ethics instead. Could you just explain how you've analyzed that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been very interesting, having been working in the sphere of human rights for years. It's sort of, there's been a curve, and it's partly a political curve. It's not only in the tech sphere, where certainly here in the UK, the Human Rights Act came into law in 2000, and we were all trained on human rights, and everybody was talking about human rights, and it was, it was the great fashionable thing. Now, 21 years later, we're not interested in human rights, we're talking about ethics. We still have the Human Rights Act, it's still in law. But this shift to talk about ethics takes you away from obligations, if you like. It means that what you're talking about are optional things that make you better, and they're feel good opt-in things, rather than actually having to think carefully about the legal framework that you're operating in, and recognizing that there are these legal standards, and those legal standards are there to protect all of us as well. I mean, we all have human rights, and in the digital space, the kind of things we're talking about today affect every single one of us. It's not somebody on the other side of the world that we want to have a campaign about. It's every single one of us. And I think it's a very interesting shift, this idea from sort of ethics or to ethics away from human rights, because in my view, human rights law is ethics with teeth, if you like. It's the law with a social conscience, and it's global law with a social conscience, and it applies to all of us. It applies to all members of the UN. It applies globally.
So what do we do about this problem that you're increasingly honing in on? Is it to enforce the existing law surrounding human rights in new ways when it comes to the digital sphere? And if so, how might that look?
I think a part of it is enforcement, and I think when you get to legal enforcement, you do land up with very different cultural approaches. Even though we have universal human rights, the way they're applied in domestic laws are really quite different. But I also have a feeling that actually, awareness raising, and for each and every one of us to internalize the fact that we have our rights, that our rights are under threat, and that actually we don't want them to be under threat, and to remember why they're important, may well also push business and policymakers to actually think about them more carefully and take them more seriously in designing the future. And one of the things I think is really important about particularly the right to freedom of thought is that once we lose it, we can't get it back. And without freedom of thought, we have no innovation. And, in lockdown last year, I went back and read George Orwell's 1984, because it just seemed like the right thing to be reading in lockdown. And that was precisely one of his points, was that, in a society where you've lost freedom of thought, technology and scientific discovery effectively die. That they eat themselves, if you like. So it's really in all our interests as individuals, but also, technologists, to see our future, a future where we're protecting freedom of thought.
But concretely, what should we do now? Is there anything, do you have any concrete proposals yet? I know you're writing a whole book about this and everything, so maybe I'm pressing prematurely here.
I think it's such a hugely complex problem. There isn't a silver bullet, but I think shifting the focus away from the periphery. So what we saw here with Cambridge Analytica, everybody rushes and says, oh, there's been a data breach. Oh, there's been, there's been an issue about political spending. And it's like, that's just nibbling around the edges. I think what we need to do when we see things like this is step back. And one of the things I found interesting there was, while we had parliamentary grandstanding about, the politics and the money, all of the British politicians, pretty much to a man and woman, went through and voted in a Data Protection Act with an exemption for political parties, which allows British political parties to use our data in any way pretty much that they want, in a very, very broad way, in a way that in Spain, the Spanish Constitutional Court found was unlawful. And so I think I think what we do need to do is, when we're looking at these issues, we do need to take a step back and kind of say, okay, well, what is the core of this? The core of it is not about spending on elections. The core of it is not just about a data breach. The core of it is this kind of question of our autonomy and how do we address that? And in my view, in, for example, the UK, well, you get rid of the political parties exemption as you have in Spain. And those answers are not going to be the same across the board in every context. But I think whenever you get something like this, you just need to take a step back and say, what is the fundamental problem? What is the fundamental impact that we need to address? Great.
Well, thank you. And actually, the session after the next one, Ben Pring is going to touch on some of these same points with some might say, fairly draconian proposals. For example, to ban all political advertising on social media. And he also, although he doesn't put into words quite exactly this issue of human rights and freedom of thought, he does talk about the manipulation of our thoughts in his new book, Monster, which he's going to be discussing with us in just 20 or 25 minutes. So thank you so much, Susie, for joining us. And I want to stay in close touch. And when you get your book out, we'll put you on here again, hopefully in a physical event where you can, I can actually see you in real life. We can see each other, but what is this? This is a new form that we're all going through here. So thank you very much, and see you again.
Thanks.